to Open Access Week 2024. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Hero MacDonald and I'm the University Librarian here at Deakin. I'm smiling because I'm looking out to a sea of library faces, so presumably you do know me, but it is a hybrid event, so we might have other people joining from the broader Deakin community and perhaps beyond. Look, before we get into this morning's keynote address, I'd just like to acknowledge, as we always do, the fact that we are meeting, working and doing business today on unceded Wurundjeri country. I'd like to pay my respects to Wurundjeri elders, past and present, and thank them for their continued care and custodianship of the lands on which we have the privilege of working. Given we're in a hybrid event today, I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which people may be joining in from across Australia and perhaps more broadly. And I'd like to pay my respects to any Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander peoples or any other First Peoples who may be joining the keynote today. Open Access Week, as colleagues here will very well know, is a really significant event in the university's calendar and for the higher education community more broadly. It's an opportunity for us to reflect on and talk about and consider and promote the value of openness in terms of scholarship and the outputs of the university community. Open access, as we know, is so critical for fostering collaboration, for fostering innovation, but most importantly, it's about ensuring that we have equity in terms of access to information, both within and beyond the walls of academia. Open Access Week 2024 continues with the theme that we explored last year during Open Access Week, which is community over commercialisation. It asks us to consider and prioritise approaches to open scholarship that serve the best interests of the public and the academic community. Last year, I had the privilege of delivering the keynote address and I sort of explored the question of whether a for-profit commercial scholarly publishing system is actually in the best interests of research and researchers. And it might surprise you to revisit the fact that my answer was really no. And I think Danny today will probably be revisiting a lot of those same themes. I explored that, the notion of big business within scholarly communication and publishing and looked at the increasing consolidation of publishing companies and the increasing control that they have over the entire life cycle of research, starting at data and publishing right through to research evaluation, reward and recognition. And I know that a lot of those things will be explored further in Danny's keynote today. And so we are honoured to welcome Dr. Danny Kingsley here to deliver the keynote presentation for OA Week 2024. I feel like when we're talking about scholarly communication and Open Access Week, it kind of, whether we need to give an introduction to Danny is probably, the question. I think she's very, very well known to everyone who has an interest in open access and scholarly communication. Over the course of Danny's incredibly diverse and very interesting career, she's really been at the forefront of open access advocacy. Her work has really influenced policy both nationally and internationally. And she's widely regarded, I think, as one of the sort of preeminent thought leaders, both here and internationally, in terms of scholarly communication and open access. Danny's research, and she is an active researcher as well as thought leader, really centres on scholarly communication and including academic reward structures, scholarly infrastructure, and open access advocacy, and the internet connections between all of those things. Danny's many and varied achievements include spearheading Cambridge University's position statement on open research, a piece of work that was really the catalyst for many institutions, both within the UK and more broadly, to develop their own open research position statements, which I think is a really significant sort of cascade of action that demonstrates the impact of Danny's work. Danny's sphere of influence, though, extends far beyond her institutional roles. She's played a very pivotal role here in terms of establishing what is now the Australasian Open Access Strategy Group, and of course sits on a number of boards and advisory groups, including the Australian Academy of Science, National Committee for Data in Science, and the Force 11 Board of Directors. But most importantly, and I would say this because we have a vested interest, I'd say Danny is Deakin Library's Director of Information. And so, I think, Danny, it is such a privilege to work with you as a colleague in this space, and to work with you on setting what I think is emerging as a really progressive agenda for Deakin University, leading the way in terms of thinking around open research, open scholarship, and open access. So today's Danny's keynote will provide, I think, a really good foundation for the rest of the OA Week events that we've got planned here. And I think it's sure to be a thought-provoking presentation. I expect that Danny is going to be covering quite a bit of serious territory today, and I have been warned that tissues may be required. So if you don't have any to hand, please go and avail yourself of any sort of tissue-like material that may be of use throughout the presentation. Anyway, I am just going to quickly wrap up before I hand over to Danny and say, look, we've got a whole series of great events planned for OA Week this year. Please make sure you check out the program if you haven't already. And I do just want to give a shout out to the fact that OA, open access and open scholarship, it is a global challenge. It's a wicked challenge, and it needs action at, international, national, institutional levels, but also at an individual level. So for any active researchers who are on the call and listening into the webinar today, please make sure you check out our call to action. We've got 5 actions that have been identified, things that you can do to meaningfully advance open access within your own personal research practice. Read and share an article from a Diamond OA journal, put OA on the agenda at your next, staff meeting, add an article from a Diamond OA journal to one of your reading lists, unit reading lists. Go green, add an author-accepted manuscript of a published article to Elements, and go and find out your OA publishing percentage and challenge yourself to improve your open access percentage. Look, we've got, I just want to also very quickly give thanks to the organising committee who've put together today's event and all the other events in OA Week. I'm just going to name these people now: Angela Gleeson, Angie Williamson, Astrid Bobble, Caitlin Savage, Jackson Mann, Dominic Curry, Lauren Halcombe-Smith, of course, and Lucinda Buckley. So a huge thank you to the organising committee. And of course, a big thanks to our library communications team, Amy Clark and Tash Atkins, for the incredible communication support that they've provided. So wonderful to have you all here today. Danny, thank you so much for coming along to deliver the keynote. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Danny Kingsley to deliver the keynote address.
Thank you, Hero. And it's always a bit embarrassing when people are doing that sort of thing. You feel like you're at your own funeral. But anyway, so let's get going. We've got a lot to get through, but hold on to your hats, kids, because this is a wild ride. Okay, so what we're going to do first is we're just going to talk about where things started in the early years. So OA in the 1990s to today. So in the early 1990s, that was when open access sort of started. It wasn't called open access at the time, but in 1991, the physics community that was already sending by mail versions of their work to one another for checking said, oh, let's use FTP. And then the problems were that they were too big. And they said, I know, let's put them into a central place and then you can just pull them out. And that was the first repository, which is still going forward, Archive. Online journals sort of started in about 1993. The web went commercial in 95. And so there was a lot of conversation then about, we don't need these publishers anymore. And publishers went, that sounds dangerous. So the first big deal was started in 1996. Big deals were a direct response to open access. So this is the final paragraph from my 1995 honours thesis, which looked at what do academics think of these newfangled online journals? Spoiler alert, they thought they were crap. But my summary was at the end, what is likely to happen is that publishers will work out some way to gain revenue from publishing electronically and will begin doing so in earnest. They have the power and the resources to force a change. And then I said, unfortunately, for a myriad of reasons, this whole issue could become economic. So that was my future seeing view, which was pretty accurate in the end. So then in the noughties, we started, so that the what's on the bottom of these are policies, and on the top is infrastructure. So we had things like ePrints and DSpace as repositories were being built. And then we also had something in Australia in 2005 called the Systemic Infrastructure Initiative. And that was the thing that allowed all the money to go out to all the different institutions to build repositories. We were very much in this time talking about repositories as the solution for open access, the community-based work. And then we ended up with First Open Repositories. A conference happened in 2006, and all the conversation was about which system do we use? Do we use DSpace or ePrints? It wasn't until a few years later when we worked out nobody was putting stuff in them that actually what we needed to do was talk to the academics about what they needed, who knew. And that was pretty much the conclusion of my PhD, which I handed in 2008, which was that there was a marketing issue to do with repositories and open access, and we needed to be conscious of disciplinary differences. So that was the sort of outcome of the work that I did there. And then in the teens, the thing that really made a big difference was in 2012. So not just that Sci-Hub started in 2012, it was actually that the Finch report came out. And Janet Finch was a government minister at the time, and she did a big study for the government, which was looking at, we put a lot of money into research, what's happening with it? And the outcome of that report was, well, it should be open access. So we all went, yay. But then they said the way it should be made open access is maybe we should pay for it to be made open access. So people like us went, boo. And so that was what came out in 2012. And then we had other different sort of court cases against Sci-Hub. And then there was things that ResearchGate court cases as well. And in the UK, there was a whole lot of activity that I went down over and got involved in. So this Finch report, the way that they put repositories as something that was good for grey literature, good for preservation. It was sort of like the real stuff's over here, publishing open access. The repositories are kind of not that great. Now, the thing was with that Finch report, there were the publishers were on members of that group, that committee, on two levels. One, because they published research, but secondly, because they're a large employer in England. And so when you read a lot of publishing stuff, it was very clear from reading the Finch report, it was written by publishers. Slight echoes of what's been happening in Australia recently. Just as an aside, value of repositories. When I wrote a paper a couple of years ago with some colleagues, we wanted to reference the Finch report. It was nowhere online. It had dropped off the web pages. This report that had huge implications for open access. It's a really seminal report, and it had disappeared. So we managed to find from the Wayback Machine a version of it, and it's now in the APO repository. So this is another reason why repositories are valuable. It's for multiple reasons. So in the UK, what happened was the government said, we think this is all a great idea. Why don't we invest £10 million to help the universities move to open access? We'll give Research Councils UK £10 million. The thing was that at Cambridge, as at other universities, we were also bound by the Charities Open Access Fund, which was a gold first fund. So pay for open access, make it available, whereas Research Councils was put it in a repository unless the embargo is too long, then pay for it. And who knew? Suddenly all the embargoes extended, but that's another story. And we also had the Higher Education Funding Council for England, which was green, put it in a repository. So that graphic on the right-hand side was put together by Arthur Smith, who worked for me and my team at Cambridge, which is the decision tree we had to go through because many, many papers were affected by all three of those policies. It was a bit of a nightmare. So the other thing was we were paying huge amounts of money to the publishers, and we said, look, come on, this is ridiculous. We're paying you for your subscriptions. We're also paying you enormous amounts of money for article processing charges. So what we ended up with was offset agreements. And those offset agreements were said, if you have paid, well, the most simple one was the American Physical Society. So they said, if you've spent X on subscriptions and Y on APCs, we'll give you 90% back of the Y you've spent on APCs. And that worked quite well. In terms, they were all quite different from one another, which was a bit of a balancing challenge. But the thing about offsets was it was at the institutional level. So Cambridge, huge publisher, spending lots of money. So we got a lot of money back, whereas a smaller universities got less money back. So it wasn't a one size fits all. The thing was, the whole idea about the government investing all this money was they're saying, what's going to happen is everyone's going to go along this route and all the journals are going to flip. And that did not work. And so, for example, we've got 1 in 55 of Elsevier's journals flipped in that 5-year period. So it failed. So what then happened was in September 2018, Plan S came out. Coalition S said, we're sick of this, we're sick of spending money on hybrid. You guys are not doing anything about this, you're not taking it seriously. And so what they said was, we will only pay for hybrid if that hybrid is a transformative journal, if it's a journal that has a plan to transform to open access. But the problem was, we ended up with another different big deal. And that's where we are now. So the corporate capture of open access. Remember, we started with it being a community thing with repositories. It's now a corporate open access environment. And this is a bit of a worrying, scary slide, but it's talking about from 2019. So remember, the Coalition S started in September 2018. So from 2019 to 2023, we've had a tripling in spending. So it hasn't really worked as a way of reducing funds. So there's been a huge corporate capture of the open access environment. So that's that. Moving on. We've got a problem, a really big one. Okay, here's just a couple of headlines. Why scientific fraud is suddenly everywhere. Why research fraud is getting worse. And I can't read that one because I haven't got my glasses on, but it's another one that's about fraud and that just everything out there in the big wide world being wrong. This is a problem for us. These headlines are a problem for us. Even if they weren't true, they're a problem because we're in an environment that's a post-truth environment. We've all experienced the COVID thing. We've all got a relative or a friend who went down the dark side and has believed all the conspiracy theories. This feeds conspiracy theories. This feeds the you can't trust science problem. And if you can't trust science, why are we paying so much money for universities? But, you know, maybe it's not true. Or maybe it is. Okay, so here's just some issues that we've got out there. So the gift authorship, there are a couple of studies that were done. One was done in Denmark and one was done in Australia, which was talking to early career researchers about gift authorship. That is a whole lot of people putting their names on papers, even though they don't do any work. So this gift authorship problem is really, really serious. We've also got questionable authorship. So we've got authorship for sale, lots of examples of ways you can buy authorship on different articles. I've seen one where it's been an accepted article and you pay more for being the second author or you pay less for being the fourth author. And then you've got this situation where you've got the scientists publishing a paper every 5 days. I write papers. It's a very, very long process to write a paper. So that those scientists are not published, they're not writing those papers. And then you've got citation problems. So you've got things like citation cartels and so on. So there's a whole lot of, and this is a tiny snapshot of what's going on. We've also got the problem with paper mills. So paper mills are capitalising on all that money that's starting to churn through the system about publishing for publishing open access. For those people who are in my directorate, I sent out a list, it's still going on. I published, I was co-author of the American Geological Union's new data policy. And since then, a couple of weeks ago, I have been spammed by, it'd be 30 now, different journals, things like Space Frontier and Fashion Marketing, saying, we saw your really interesting paper, insert paper name, we would like you to submit a paper to our journal. So this sort of stuff goes on all the time. So that's a predatory publisher. Paper mills are another thing, another version again, where it's just churning out the papers. And of course, AI is it's a godsend for this sort of thing. And the problem we've got with this is it actually affects the science we do. So what we've got is the natural selection of bad science, that article there from the Royal Society. And one of the other problems we've got is that insistence on publishing many, many, many papers, that pressure to work, what the PhD students, early career students were talking about, is it creates really poor working conditions for the academics. The amount of work they have to do to churn this stuff out just to keep their heads above water means that what we end up having is people just leaving. So the graphic that's there on the right-hand side was talking about what's the kind of hardest thing you have to deal with. And mostly it's about trying to get funding to keep yourself going. But this paper about nearly 50% of researchers quit science within a decade, this is a really massive study that got published like last week. And there's an example there, Chris Jackson, who's a fantastic bloke, but he was very big in the open area and did a lot of public-facing work. And I was on panels with him and things, and the kind of vitriol and crap he got, he just went, I'm out of here. So that's what happens. You get great people who just go, I'm sick of this, I don't want to do it. And the problem with all of these things comes into research integrity. And we've got a problem with research integrity. Institutions are really slow to deal with it. And so we've got institutions trying to sort of protect themselves. There's a couple of really quite interesting cases here. The study there about research institutions pay lip service to integrity rule was a study that was done by Adrian Barnett. He's based at QUT. And what there was trying to work out, are academics aware of the research integrity unit? Is there stuff on the website that's easy to find? The answer is no and no. The Academies of Science have asked for a long time, can we get like some sort of research integrity unit that's Australia-wide? Because at the moment it's done at the institutional level, and it's not in the institution's best interest to make this sort of thing public. Stuff gets buried and buried and buried, and there's many, I could show you many slides of headlines of various researchers who've been fired and various other things for, fraudulent work, etc. Again, feeding the conspiracy mill. This is an article, there's a preprint that came out last week. Academies of Science asked me to have a look at it. And it's saying that 1 in 7 articles is fake. And this is the area of forensic scientometrics, where they use all sorts of like high level kind of systematic ways of looking at work and understanding patterns that would indicate there are problems. So the problems could be things like manipulated images, it could be made up data, it could be all sorts. There's a myriad of kinds of things. And the point that this paper's trying to make is that there's a collective unwillingness to recognise this problem has grown to the point of outrageous, willful ignorance. Priorities must change or science will start to die. And I don't think that's an overstatement. So let's go back to 1942. In 1942, there was a guy called Robert K. Merton, who was an amazing thinker, and he wrote lots of different pieces, one of which is The Sociology of Science. When I do talks that are closer to home, I actually bring the book. It's very, very big and heavy, and I drop it down on the thing to give this thwack factor, the really loud bang. That's just one of his sort of sets of work. And so he talked about the normative structure of science, which is the different sort of things that make science work. I'm not talking about those today. I'm talking about this. Remember, 1942, middle of World War II. So he's saying incipient and actual attacks upon the integrity of science have made scientists realise their dependence on particular types of social structure. So an institution under attack must re-examine its foundations, restate its objectives, and seek out its rationale. And I'd argue that we are back in 1942 now. The time has come for us to have this kind of really serious reevaluation of the way we're doing things, because what we're doing, the kinds of systems that were in place for the scale of 1942 are not working for the scale of 2024. So what is behind all of this? That's 2 things, money and prestige. And really prestige leads to money, so it's really about money. Rankings. We love a ranking in Australia. We are just really in love with rankings. We're so in love with rankings that we actually have got 2 universities merging for the purpose of increasing their kind of status in the rankings. Right? There is something really warped about that rationale. So we just love rankings here, especially when rankings is just really a global confidence trick. So rankings are run by publishing companies like the Times Higher Education. So we've got a bunch of journalists making these decisions on our behalf. Thank you very much. The processes under which the rankings are put together would never pass an ethics proposal. There is no rationale. Any academic looking at that, if it was presented to them as this is the way I'm going to run this research, this is how I'm going to do this evaluation, would laugh it out of the room. And yet we are running, like the Labor government in South Australia, was down there when it was going on, went to the polls with that as one of their big things, that we'll join these 2 universities together to get us up in the rankings. So it's affecting our politics. This is a great book. I wrote a review of it called Breaking Ranks, and how the rankings industry rules higher education and what to do about it. In this particular one, Colin Diver was a senior administrator in one of the universities in the US. He is talking particularly about the World News Ranking, which looks at just the Ivy League universities, but he goes into enormous detail about the kind of decision-making that's happening at the back end and universities to try and ensure that they stay in these rankings, so that we are twisting ourselves and in knots to lie down, to be driven over by the rankings truck. And we just keep going. The problem is that the information that feeds rankings is big data companies that were once upon a time just academic publishing companies. It's the same people. It's the same companies. So what we've got here on the right is Clarivate purchase of ProQuest and delayed. It did go through eventually, but it was such a big thing that even the Federal Trade Commission in the US just went, oh, hang on, we might just want to have a look at this one. And so some people call it the platformization of scholarly information, and others call it vertical integration. The problem with anti-competitive work is that usually it's if you're in the same horizontal alignment. Anti-competitive work does not work when you're vertically integrated. So what that picture is down the bottom is the entire life cycle and all the different products that Elsevier have bought over the years and maintained the original product branding of. So you may or may not realise that these products are all Elsevier products, but they are. And this is quite old now. It's worse now. That graph work was done in 2017, so we're 7 years on. So if we think about the data that's used for these things like rankings, they come from two companies, Clarivate and Elsevier, or Elsevier is sometimes known as Relics. So Clarivate does the Journal Impact Factor, Excellence in Research for Australia that ended up not going through, but we were using Clarivate, Research Excellence Framework, and we've got the ARWU rankings as well. That's all Clarivate world. And in the Elsevier world, we've got the Times Higher Education rankings, which just come out, and the QS rankings. So reliance on two sets of data, basically, and those sets of data aren't actually very good. So if we look here, this is some study that looked at the open journal systems. And so open journal systems are diamond journals. They are free to publish and free to use, although some people do charge article processing charges if they're running a journal using open journal systems. But it's open source. It's a program that is built for people to be able to say, take it off the shelf and I can run my journal with it. Hundreds of thousands of journals are out there using OJS. And this particular study looked at 5.8 million items that run across all these different countries around the world. And 1.2% of those are in the Web of Science and 5.7 are in Scopus. So these things will go back. These are missing vast amounts of research that is happening out there. And that's what we're basing all these decisions on for rankings and so on. There's a major problem there. There's a open source product out called Open Alex, and there's also Dimensions. So I haven't mentioned digital science. So Dimensions is another product that's out there. So what this study did was compare Dimensions and Open Alex versus the Web of Science. And they're saying they retrieved twice as many articles compared to Web of Science. So these products are not, we pay for them, by the way, lots of money, and they're not very good. And this is another study that looked at the significant differences across the databases. And so the differences contribute to drastic changes in the rank positions of universities, which is the worst for those universities that are in non-English speaking countries. And if you're outside the top positions. So the whole thing's a house of cards. So what we've got is we've got a publishing system that started as a community-based one that's moved into a commercial one. Those same companies now own the research information that we use to make really serious decisions about our institutions, about our politics, about who we hire. That need for publishing, and because the only jewel in the crown is your published article, therefore your name on the author list has leading to all this really bad behaviour of gift authorship and buying authorship and citation cartels to push yourself up journal impact rankings and so on and so forth. So that we've ended up in this maelstrom of really poor research and poor work, which is all fed and pushed by our insistence on things like measuring bibliometrics. It's really problematic. So you can't take away, you can't say, I'm just going to look at open access, or I'm just going to look at research integrity, or let's just look at scholarly communication, because any one of those things is all interconnected. And if you try and move that, this one's going to get bigger, or that one, this one's going to get bigger. We need to join the thinking up. It's all the same thing. So here's a couple of articles I've just written in in LinkedIn, which is talking about interconnectedness of things, but also ignoring the whole picture at your peril, which was something of a veiled conversation about some plans to try and open up access in Australia, because I think that that's trying to access one aspect and it's completely ignoring all of the other implications that will sit around if we just look at one aspect. So sometimes it's not easy to understand the link between open science and research integrity. Like, you sort of think they sound like they're kind of different things. But basically, we've got a problem where being a good scientist is not necessarily the same thing as being a successful one. So if you're successful, you might be successful because you're doing all the dodgy stuff and actually your actual work is crap. So that's not a good outcome. We don't want that outcome. We want successful researchers to be the good ones, ideally. Now, if we talk about open research, and when we discuss the idea of open research or open science, and when I say science here, I'm saying science in the context of scienta, the Latin word for knowledge. Okay, so when everyone's talking about open science, we're not rejecting the humanities, we're not rejecting the social sciences, we're talking about knowledge. So when we were in the UK, I was talking about open research, and what we're talking about here is things like opening up your code, making your data available if you can, obviously making your articles available, making your method available. There are some journals which will do the peer review on the method rather than your results. So if it turns out your results are null results, but your peer review has gone through, the null result's quite useful. Then somebody else knows not to waste time doing that. So open research incorporates many, many aspects of the research process. And the thing is, when you have all of this work open, the ability to pick up problems further earlier down the chain is much easier. It makes it much more challenging for people to be bad actors and also just to make mistakes, because it can get picked up and fixed up earlier. So open research and research integrity are quite deeply connected. So we need to broaden our approach. When we talk about open access, we're often just talking about the gold route or the green route, or the diamond route or bronze route, or however many colours we want to think about, or sponsored. But really what we've got is all these other aspects about things like open notebooks, open workflows, reproducibility guidelines, open workflow tools, organisational mandates, subject policies. Very, very complicated environment, but very, very comprehensive. So that's all the bad. That's the tissues, okay? So if we manage to get through this bit without having to, grab the tissues and blow your nose loudly, we can get into the good stuff. So what's happening? What can we do about it? For a start, we need to change the way we train our researchers. So what we have traditionally in academia is a master apprentice system. So you go and sit at the foot of the master who teaches you the ways of the area of the research, all the skills you need to do the finding and to do the experimenting and to do the planning and all that sort of stuff for your discipline. You may or may not have a supervisor who actually understands any of what I've just talked about, because most academics are quite oblivious to a lot of this. It's like kind of not really in their, it's not really their thing. Why would, when I'm just doing this? So you may or may not have somebody who knows about it. And even if they do, you may or may not have somebody who's prepared to share that information. It's completely arbitrary. We don't have any sort of structures around this. So I often in my career have gone and worked with HDR students and sort of talked to them about some of this stuff, about how it all works. Why hasn't anyone told us this? This is essential. It's like, I know. So I think what we really need to do is we need to agree as a sector on what are the things that are beyond the bench, the stuff that is universal about the endeavour of being a researcher. It's going to be slightly different depending on the discipline you're in, but this general thing about how you're measured, how you'd make decisions about what journal you're publishing in, why you'd want to, how you want to push yourself through promotions or not, et cetera, that stuff should be agreed on. And we should take it out of the random hands of academics who don't necessarily have any interest or knowledge about this and look at this more holistically in a structured way. And the article there about the divide between academic and support staffs, talking about something called the third space, where we argued that there are a lot of people in research projects who are not academics who are contributing to the research work. And an example is systematic reviews in library spaces is a good example, but often research data management and various other things. At the moment, non-academic staff, professional staff, can't apply for research grants, for example. We've got this really, really heavy divide in the academic world. At ANU, when I was there, we were all called general staff. So everyone was general staff. So it's like, and then they decided to call the people who weren't the cleaners and stuff, like the people who are working more in professional space, professional staff. And I pointed out, I'm like one of the few experts in the world in the area at the time of open access. I can't supervise anybody because I don't have an academic placement because I'm professional or general staff. So we've got to get over that. Because the other thing is, if we develop standards for research practice training, then we know what we need to get the skills we need as the support staff for this. This stuff doesn't happen magically. Repositories don't build themselves. People don't know about open access themselves. So we need our community in the sort of support third space community to know what they need to know. We're kind of guessing at the moment. So this is really quite important. There's no framework, by the way. So there's some sort of things that relate to some of this stuff. So there's work that's been done about workforce capacity and skills for data-intensive science. That was some work that was done by the OECD. There's the Vitae framework, but that was 2011, and it doesn't really mention stuff about publishing. It says publishing, but only publishing. It doesn't say about aspects around publishing. So we don't have anything yet. So in 2020, this came out, and they were saying that one of the things we needed to do was identify key competencies, skills, and roles required for data-intensive science in different contexts. Yes, and we still do. We need to change the way we evaluate. So this is something called SCOPE, the 5 stages of the SCOPE framework. And I need to put my spectaculars on because I can't see that. I'm between vision eyes. So we need to sort of start with what you value and consider the context, and then options for publishing, and then can't even read that one. Probe deeply and evaluate your evaluation. So that's the SCOPE framework for evaluation. And one of the things that's in there, and this is really relevant for discussions around non-traditional research outputs, is the inclusivity of diverse outputs and practices. Because those bibliometric databases, Clarivate, Web of Science, and Scopus for Elsevier and so on, they're not looking at non-traditional research outputs. They're looking at extremely traditional research outputs because they're the ones that are easy to count. So all this other work is just missing from that conversation. So rankings are being rejected around the world. So this article came out on the right-hand side, which was talking about the coloniality of global university rankings. And it's partly based on this whole question about the English-speaking languages being the ones that are listed in Web of Science and so on. And so therefore, we've got this situation where non-English-speaking countries either have to put an enormous amount of effort into publishing in English or they get left off. And it was on that basis of the coloniality that Rhodes University said, we're not doing this anymore, we're out. University of Utrecht also said, this whole thing is just complete garbage, we're not playing the game anymore, and they're out as well. We also need to think about the infrastructure we use. So this came out last year, which is a declaration on open research information. And there's a bit of nuance about this, about open research information. So I had an argument online with somebody from Figshare who'd said, here's our presentation we just gave about our open research infrastructure. And I said, oh, just nitpicking here. It's commercial infrastructure that supports open research rather than open infrastructure. And they said, oh, not compared to these kind of different definitions. And I said, well, I think we need a distinction between open infrastructure and open research infrastructure. They're two different things. Open infrastructure is community-led. It's run by the community, owned by the community. I used to work for OOPEN, which is the online library of open access books, and the director of open access books. That is not-for-profit, cannot be sold, supported by the community. That is open infrastructure. It's not FOPEN infrastructure, which is a term that's used by Jeffrey Builder, which is where they'll use things like not-for-profit or community supported, but not the word open. You really need to be careful. The open is implied, but there's a lot of open washing that's going on in the commercial space here. So there are also groups that are rejecting the commercial bibliodatabases. So Sorbonne University is unsubscribed from the Web of Science, and CNRS, which is like the French research organisation, have unsubscribed from the Scopus database, and they're moving to more open options like OpenAlex. So that's something that we're sort of wanting to perhaps explore what that could possibly look like. And we may come to the conclusion we don't want to do that, but we at least want to explore it. And we can also change the organisations we support. Clarivate and Elsevier receive literally tens of millions of dollars from the Australian taxpayer, more probably, each year. So we're feeding this beast. We're actively feeding it. So we could choose not to do that if we wanted to. We could choose to support open infrastructure and open organisations instead. And now we've got, there's Invest in Open Infrastructure, which is on the right-hand side, now has a Finder infrastructure. So it's a service that allows you to say, I need something that can help me do blah, 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 and an open option. It will give you open options for it and put you in contact with those people. Lots of open sources of information and solutions to choose from, and different organisations are taking that on. That little one in the corner there is COKI, which is the Curtin Open Knowledge Institute. Very, very powerful work that's happening over in Perth. Analyses across what's happening in the open space across the world. Sadly, Australia sits there not doing much and continues to not do much. It's very, very depressing, but hopefully we'll start moving. We also need to change the way we publish. So Diamond Open Access, which are open, free to read, free to publish in, are really getting organised. They've been going for a long time. Open Journal Systems has been going for like 20 years, I think, or not quite, but getting close to it. But there's now sort of the German finance grant agency is supporting the action plan for Diamond Open Access. So Diamond Open Access is getting organised. This is why the word sponsored is starting to come into the equation. We've had a bit of arguments over the years about language in the open space. So back in the day, we had green open access and gold open access. And green was Stephen Harnett who put this together, and he was a bit of a greenie. So green was the sort of repository version, and gold was the published open access in the first place, paid or not. But publishers have pushed and pushed and pushed, and now gold is kind of code for pay to publish. So we needed a different name for not paying to publish, but open access. And so the word Diamond Open Access came up. But diamonds are fancier than gold. So we need a different word. So now the word that's being flown around is, oh, they're sponsored. They're the sponsored journals. It's not sustainable. So these words around trust and sustainability are being weaponized in these discussions about openness, where the non-commercial versions, the community environment is considered to be not sustainable. Well, I tell you, it would be sustainable if it was getting tens of billions of dollars from the taxpayers around the world. It'd be extremely sustainable. Okay, so there's other global activity that's happening. We've got the UNESCO recommendation on open science. And we've also got the case for reforming scientific publishing. And this is a really interesting one. So that's from the International Science Council. And what they've talked about is that there is a problem with publishers using a divide and rule process where regional entities are addressed one by one in closed negotiations. Does that ring a bell to anybody? Conversations that are going on at the moment about a possible public access model just in Australia. It's exactly what they're talking about there. The UNESCO recommendation on open science happened a couple of years ago. All the countries that are signed up to UNESCO, and we are one of them, are supposed to report in 2025, February 2025, on our activity to date against those recommendations. When I wrote to UNESCO a couple of months ago, because we were supposed to nominate our person on by the 28th of July, I wrote to them and said, did anybody from Australia nominate? And the answer was no. So we are embarrassingly missing off that list currently. There's a lot of scrambling going on to try and work out whose responsibility it actually is. We also need to change the way we manage our own IP. So this is some work that's been done by a big research project funded by the ARC on who actually owns research outputs from universities. And it turns out it's much more complex than you think. So a lot of the times that academics are signing away their IP in a publishing agreement, they don't actually, it's not even their IP necessarily to sign away. It depends on their enterprise bargaining agreement, and it depends on their IP policies within their institutions, which are often in contradiction to one another. So that's what this group found when they went around and spoke to all the different institutions. It was a lot of the time a big fat mess. And there were conflicting policies all over the shop, and none of those things talked to each other. And also every time they spoke to different people in the chain of academia and responsibility in the university, they go, it's not my responsibility to look after this. But it is. It's everyone's and no one's responsibility to look after this. So the argument here with this really substantial piece of work in Australia is that we need to adopt the strongest formulation of university rights retention, and in which case we can then say, we are putting a copy of this into our repository immediately on publication. Forget the embargo rubbish, we're just going to do that because we can, because it is ours. So the really good news is that particular project convened a roundtable in June this year as part of the final kind of process of the research work. And that happened in Canberra, which I attended, and we agreed that we needed an open research national coalition, which has now finally, it's taken a couple of months to get organised, but we are going to be having our initial meeting of that coalition Tuesday next week. So we might finally be starting to get some traction in this space, which would be fantastic. And so the summary of all of this is we started community-led and we ended up being captured into the corporate environment. But that same corporate industry has expanded into infrastructure and drives the research rankings and assessment systems. So what that then has done is spawn a major industry in fraud and poor research practice. And we are funding them to do this. So the successful researcher is not the same thing as a good researcher. 1942 Merton called for science to re-examine itself. We've got a scale that was unimaginable then. Scientific publishing exploded in the 1950s. At the time in the 40s, it was still pretty much just community-led. It was sort of like scholarly societies and so on. It was in the 50s that the commercial research publishing industry really started and cranked up and is now the monolith that it is now. What we had then is not able to cope with what we've got now. We cannot keep trying to operate the way we have. We've got to fundamentally change the way we approach the entire research ecosystem. Definitely assessment, in some ways the assessment part's the easy bit, but the actual publishing and the review and so on of our work, that also needs some pretty major change. That's hard. But open science, including open infrastructure, reduces the opportunity for poor research practice, moves away from bad research. It increases diversity and inclusion. And ultimately, it will be cheaper. It's not free, but it will be cheaper. So the time's now. We don't have any time to waste. We've got a really big problem. AI is looming and it's just going to make all of this stuff worse. So we need to grow up and become part of the global conversation. We need attention on open research or open science. That's policies, that's infrastructure. And this is at the government, funder, academies, institutional, scholarly societies, and individual levels, everybody. And so everyone has a role in this. It's a collective and a community responsibility for us to do something about it. So this is our calls to action for you to do something about it. I'm going to leave that up and close off here and open the floor for questions. Is everyone getting their tissues out?
Danny? Give everyone else the opportunity to think. I mean, you've talked a lot about the very interconnected nature of things, both in your research and in today's presentation. But it does seem like a truly wicked problem to join up those conversations, noting at an institutional level, at a national level in terms of government, many of those things sit in different buckets, in different portfolios. How do we join up those conversations? And who's done it well, if anyone?
The Dutch have. So the Dutch have done some really interesting work on, they did a project called Room for Everyone's Talent. And what that looked at was all the different contributions you might make into the research environment. So, because what I haven't talked about is research culture. I talked about a little bit like people leaving, but the problem with research culture is it's really, really bad. I attended something at the Royal Society a few years back, which was really quite eye-opening. And in that, at this workshop, there were two people who were sitting at this table. One of them was a professor at Cambridge, and the other one was a senior member at another university, both women. And they both talked about something that had happened in their early career where they'd had a falling out with their supervisor, like their postdoc, falling out with a supervisor because they had rejected the opportunity to have sexual relations with that person, who then said, I'm not writing you a reference letter. And they both said, I was really lucky that X university took me on. And you're thinking, what environment is this that you think that that's lucky? Like if you're a professor at Cambridge University, you're clearly very, very good. And your whole career could have been ruined because of something like this. So that culture conversation was really interesting. And then I was talking, because they had industry people there too. And so there was somebody in the chemicals industry, I can't remember which company it was, but she said, when we do our annual review stuff, we look at two things. We look at like, what's your research output, but also what's your supervisory output? Where have your staff ended up? So what we don't necessarily do very well here is we don't necessarily look at, where do your PhD students end up in 3 years' time or 5 years' time? And that doesn't necessarily mean having to go into academia. How have they contributed to society? We're asking the wrong questions about value, I think, is what's happening here. So if we start at an institutional level, changing the sorts of things we say we value, if we at a country level go, you know what, this rankings thing is a joke. The problem, of course, is that the government has underfunded research for 30 years. And so we've increased our international students to pay for it. And now they're capping that. And so what the hell do we do? So that's always been the problem in Australia, is that we've actually had to supplement our research funding. And we've had to sacrifice ourselves at the feet of the international students, which is why we're so insistent on rankings. That's what that's actually about. It's all about money in the end of the day. So I don't really have an answer, but certainly asking better questions of what we value, I think, is a really good start.
Thanks, Danny. We've got a couple of questions from our online audience. So the first one is, if we cancelled our subscriptions to Scopus and Web of Science, which alternative platforms could we use? Yes, and that's the question we'd have to establish. So there are multiple ones. There's OpenAlex, and there's about 3 or 4. OpenAlex seems to be the one that many other institutions are using. But for us to do that, we'd need to look at it quite comprehensively in terms of how deeply embedded are these products already in our systems. So how much of a disruption would it be for us to say, well, we're not going to subscribe to X anymore? Does that mean we need to build new, reporting things on top of stuff? Like what impact does that have for the institution? And also, does it give us the information we need? So that's the assessment we need to do to ensure that we are not going to disadvantage ourselves. It might be we need to do a couple in parallel for a little while, a year or two, and then we can sort of like move away from one. It's not something we're going to do tomorrow. It is complicated, and this is not something just like a whim. It's going to be evidence-based, the decision we make.
Hi, Danny. You talked about the mentor and mentee model, maybe, or servant and master, or it seems to me that these matters are too important to leave up to the vagaries of whether a supervisor just so happens to be motivated or interested. Are there different models that could, convey these kind of principles and practices to HDR students without needing to rely on that relationship?
Well, and we have the Graduate Development Centre here, which is something that's really fantastic. So some institutions are really starting to take this seriously, and Deakin's one of them, which is fantastic. Swinburne actually do have a program that's available just to PhD students, which looks at a lot of this work. So if you're a PhD student, you do that in parallel. I'm a bit surprised they haven't kind of opened it up externally, because they could commercialise that and, probably make some money. But that's the thing, is that we haven't done this in any sort of structured way yet. And it sort of seems so blindingly obvious that we need to do this. So I'm involved in a group in the UK, which I got started, which is Open Competencies Open Research Competencies Coalition, we've changed the names a couple of times, OCR. And what we're trying to do is get some funding over there to do some work on the question about training our support staff up, because people like me who kind of got in at the beginning, we're not on the ground anymore. So we're still relying on people just learning on the job. It's not scalable anymore. It just isn't, especially sort of if you look at what's happening overseas with the kind of scale of, like, the scale of open here isn't that high. There it's very high. You know, if it's something like 85%, 90% of Cambridge outputs, and there's like 10,000 outputs a year, you need a lot of people. So we can't just keep training on the job. We need to have something more systematic. Ideally, you want somebody to come in and say, I've done X thing, so therefore I know why. So, you know, instead of us saying, okay, we're going to have to sacrifice an opportunity cost of a staff member to hold your hand for the first 6 months. We don't have anything like that. And it's sort of like, come on, like I got my acceptance for my stipend to do my PhD literally the day after I had my son. So I was in hospital. My husband had to bring the computer to work to the hospital so I could fill in my, you know, say yes, I'm accepting it, and so on. He's about to turn 21. He's tall. He's got bright red hair. He represents my life in this open access space, and I feel like I'm still having the same conversations I was having then now. It's so frustrating. I had a conversation with somebody in an event the other day where she was saying, you know, it's not right, is it? Because, well, they write the papers and then they edit them and they do the peer review and then we pay. And all I'm thinking is, can you talk faster so I can stop listening to you working this out for yourself? Which is really uncharitable of me, but come on. It's 21 years later. Can we just start having more sophisticated conversations, please? So there you go. That's my frustration coming out.
A question from Melissa from our online audience. Do you have a comment on the corporatisation of Australian universities alongside changing the open research space?
I think that's got a lot to do with it. Yeah. And it's you know, I don't really know the answer to that one about how we can do something about it. It's certainly something that I know anybody who's been in universities for a while has observed over the years. And a lot of this comes down to that financial question of, you know, survival. We all get paid because we have international students. They are propping us up. So, you know, it's a pretty depressing situation, really. It's hardly ideal, but you've got to survive. So yes, it's more corporate and I don't know what to do about it.
And one more from Mazia. As you mentioned, prestige is key for researchers who prioritise publishing in highly ranked journals. How do you think this mindset could be shifted? Could changes in research impact assessment help broaden the focus?
Yeah, and so that was the thing. I'm just going to go to this slide just for those people who want to know where they can find out more about open access. But that's the thing about moving away from focusing only on Web of Science and Scopus for the purposes of doing our bibliometric analyses, and perhaps broadening out what we value, because the rankings, the higher education, Times Higher Education came out last week, and also the Dutch version, the Leiden rankings came out the same day, and they were vastly different. And it's because the Leiden version uses OpenAlex, which includes all of those articles and research that's not included in Web of Science and Scopus. So suddenly when you start actually looking at the whole, suddenly China pushes itself way up the list. The whole dynamic is different. So if we start actually looking at everything and saying, well, I don't think we should be doing the rankings at all, by the way, but if we have to have rankings, if we look at everything, then let's be honest about what it is that's actually going on, rather than just going, we're good because we happen to be lucky enough to be born in a country that speaks English as its first language. You know, like, it's just luck of the draw for us having to be lucky enough to live in Australia, for example. Yeah, so that's one way of doing it. If we have to do it, let's do it properly.
Thank you, Danny, and thank you everyone who has joined us today in person and online. On behalf of the library and the Open Access Committee, we want to really sincerely thank you for today's presentation and the galvanizing inspiration that you've given us all. And those of us here in person, please join us for morning tea. And for our entire audience online as well, please do tune in for the remaining events this week. Thank you very much.